This is Henry Washington, and you're listening to the Average Joe Finances Podcast.
If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you smash the like and subscribe buttons. If you're listening to our podcast, go leave us a 5-star review. All of our links can be found in the video description or show notes below. Hey, what's going on, everybody? Mike Cavaggioni here, host of the Average Joe Finances podcast with my co-host, Tanya. And today is just an episode of Just Us. So you've got Mike and Tanya here. We're just going to have a conversation about recent events and completely unscripted, off the cuff. So Tanya, what's up? How you doing?
Yeah. Hi, guys. Yeah, I think it's good for us to just do some solo episodes together. Well, solo with both of us, because obviously, it's cool interviewing people, but it's good just talking about what's going on in the world, what's happening right now, and just some things that we see creating content on personal finance, as often as we do. What our thoughts were today, there's a couple different topics that we want to talk about, but one being the whole stock market crash, which happened in early August. This big, huge, I don't even know what you want to call it. It was just blown out, over the top. When I had a post that went somewhat viral about this crash, I put in quotation marks if you can't see me, because it was just over dramatized into what the news typically does. They don't ever talk about when it's doing well and how well it's been doing consistently. They talk about when you see these crashes. So what are your thoughts on that? What was your perception of what was going on?
Yeah, so complete panic mode, right? So everybody was looking at what happened in Japan, and that kind of reflected over here a little bit, right? And it built up into something that really was nothing. I feel like a lot of times we get into these situations where there's a blip in the matrix, I guess you could say, or some type of bump happens, an extreme drop or an extreme gain, and everybody thinks it's either the best time to do whatever or it's the worst, right? The way I look at it, when we have these dips or these little mini crashes, if because that's what people were calling it, which was insane. But when we have stuff like that, the way I look at it is, everything's on sale today. Time to start stocking up, right? So that's where my head's at. I didn't freak out. I went and looked at some of my portfolios and I was like, ooh, that's gross. But then over the next couple of days, it was back to where it was. So that day was a great buying opportunity. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, I think, as a lot of our listeners here, if they've been investing for the long term, are invested in the total stock market, so in an S&P 500 or ETF funds, not just single stocks, then you shouldn't be panicking, and money should be invested for the long term anyway. And as much as they're calling it a crash, the actual definition of a crash is that I think it loses its value by 30% or more. And the market only went down, I think, by 8% overall from the last year. So it actually wasn't even technically a dip. It was I don't even know if it's a correction, but it was so over
Dramatized.
and then we had over dramatized, and we had been on such a high for a long time. And I think one of the reasons that happened that day, there's a lot going on with, we don't get political here, but the election coming up, and part of the stock market is the forecasting of what's going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months from now. And if you look at what's going to happen in 3 to 6 months from now, there is an election, there's potential, all kinds of economical things that could happen next year. And so I think everyone's been on a high, and it was a lot of people, when they see those reports come out on predictions from companies, they start to panic, and a lot of people sold because they're like, oh, everything's been so high, I'm going to sell and make a profit. And so that technically made everything drop temporarily.
Yep. Yeah, that's what happens when people have a large portion of a business and they sell a large portion of it. You see these dips, right? So no, that's a great point. And so just so everybody knows, we're doing this completely unscripted. It was just on a whim. We were just like, hey, let's record something and talk about the current market and what's happening. With that being said, we were talking with a guest earlier today, and this kind of came up in conversation when we were talking about real estate, and we were talking about how my parents or older people are saying, this is what interest rates were when we first bought a house. And so I look at this like, oh, it's not a big deal. Well, at the same time, from back then to where we are today, the 70s versus today are two different worlds, right? You look at the price of real estate, you look at how much you need to make in order to make that work. Where back in the day, you could have had a high school diploma, right? And go out and got a minimum wage job, you and your significant other, or realistically, it was really just a one income household back then. And you'd be able to afford to buy a house, buy a
Yeah.
car,
Not to
all those good
mention all the
things.
debt, credit card debt, student loans, and personal loans that people
Yeah.
now have.
Right. And that's the thing, because you didn't have that because you didn't go to college. And nowadays, you see people graduating with six figures of student loan debt, all these other debts that they accrue just in the process of living. And they're like, okay, I'm ready to go buy a home. No, you're not, because you're not in a good place to do that. So, again, Tanya, this was just like, it's eye opening when you actually take a step back and look at that, right? And again, I'm not trying to get into politics or anything, but things were different back then to where they are today. And we're going to start to see a lot of this stuff come up in talk as we get closer to the election. There's going to be a lot of conversations about that. So it's a very interesting time. And the way I look at it is, it doesn't matter who wins come this November. Like, we're going to see a shift no matter what, no matter who gets elected into office. So it's just a matter of being ready and having yourself ready for that when it happens. What do you think?
Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts on that because I know a lot of people as real estate agents where I live, one being my boyfriend, a lot just across the United States. And what they're seeing is some stats that are really interesting. So it depends on which area you live in, right? It totally depends on your state as well. But one of the things is there's been the most cancellations. If you're already in contract, there's been the most contract cancellations in the past 2 months than there have, I think it's like 5 to, I don't know, it's like over 5+ years. So
Yeah.
because of the interest rates, because of a number of different things, homeowners insurance going up for multiple reasons, all these other things going on, there's a lot of cancellations. There's also a lot homes now staying longer on the market and seeing some price reductions because of the current interest rates. Because you used to, when you look at the difference from even 3 years ago from what your payment would have cost, it might be thousands of dollars that you have to now pay more on that payment than it was 3 years ago. So the math is the math. And then when you look at it, that's the number one thing that I know people close in the industry are saying, not to mention on top of all the changes in the real estate, like how they're doing the commissions and everything like that.
Yeah.
That are going on. So,
oh, that's a whole separate look. Realistically, I don't think much of that is changing. It's just you're going to see a lot of sellers now putting that in the contract, offering a 2.5 or 3% buyer's agent credit or something like that. I know with me, if I'm working with buyers, that's going to be part of the thing. Like, hey, when we go to write contracts, we're going to have that in there that we are requesting a 2.5% buyer's agent credit. So really nothing's going to change. It's just going to be more open, I guess, even though like on our contracts, we were always very open about that. Here in Hawaii, other
yeah, it's
states,
already
it
been
might be
going on in other
different, you know?
states. Yeah, it's they're making it a bigger thing. It's going to be having that
Just have
harder
to reword it.
But what do you think about the cancellation? Does that make sense with what you might be seeing in your area too, and like seeing stuff staying longer on the market?
Yeah. No, stuff surprisingly here in Hawaii too, there's been property staying on the market a little bit longer. And when I say a little bit longer, like a lot longer, because realistically, you would never see something on the market here in Hawaii stay for more than 30 days unless it was something just completely ridiculously overpriced. But it doesn't change the fact there's a low inventory. And because we have still historically low inventory, you're not going to see fluctuation in prices that much. A lot of people think, oh, with interest rates going up, prices are going to come down, but that has not necessarily been the case in every market, right? Because again, every market is different. So there's a lot of things to factor into it, inventory being one of them. That's something people need to take into consideration if you're looking to buy a home right now is what's the inventory like in your area? What are the interest rates at the local credit unions and banks right now? And can you really afford it? I think That's the question people need to really be asking themselves before they go and get themselves under contract. Just because a bank said yes, just because a bank said, yeah, we'll loan you this money because you qualify for it, doesn't mean it's the right move. Like, you shouldn't be, your mortgage payment, including taxes and insurance, should not be more than 30% of your income. A realistic picture, a realistic way to look at it is 28% of your pre-tax income. If it's more than that, you are setting yourself up for failure. You're buying a house that you can't afford, realistically. And I think a lot of people need to take a step back and go back to the basics. And I feel like we're losing a lot of that in today's environment, because there's so many people and there's so many gurus out there preaching all these different methods and ways to go about getting these properties. But if you're buying your primary home and you don't have other properties, you don't have other cash flow coming in to help you supplement, and you're just going off of your W-2 income, do not be over 30% for your mortgage, interest, and insurance. And then pay attention to what's going on with insurance rates and interest rates, obviously. But a lot of people don't realize, like, out here in Hawaii, a lot of insurance companies are starting to pull out, which is weird. And they're raising prices because of hurricanes. I'm like, the last hurricane that hit us was 2018, and it dissipated as soon as it hit Oahu. So I was like, what is going on here? So you got to pay attention to those things, right? So that's something I might have to deal with here shortly, is an increase in insurance. So
Yeah, it's definitely happened in California because the fires and everything going on the last
absolutely.
several
Yeah.
years. We're seeing some homeowners insurance is almost double what they were several years ago. So think about that. Like, your payment's your payment, and then you still have to figure out that probably is going to increase over time. Thinking about those type of things is really important. And also, I love the fact that you're telling them the percentage, because I think that's really tangible and something that people need to really hear, because I see this in people's budgets every day. And also, to take a step further, I think realistically, if you're not going to live somewhere a minimum of 5 years, it does not make sense to buy that house. That's a good deal. Like, as your primary residence, I don't think it makes sense. Knowing the numbers and knowing how long it takes to actually start to pay off the principal, unless you just put like half cash down, unless you have a ton of cash to put on the house. If you're not going to be in the house a minimum of 5 years, it's really hard to justify buying something.
No, so Tanya, that's a great point, because as a real estate agent out here in Hawaii, I deal with a lot of military, right? And they come out here on 3-year orders. And I'll tell them too, because in Hawaii, it's pretty safe. If you have at least 3 years here, you'll be okay. But I've met a couple people that are like, yeah, I've been on island for a year. I'm thinking about buying a place now. I'm like, how positive are you that you're going to be able to get a follow-on tour and stay here in Hawaii? Because if you have 2 years or less, like, honestly, I'll be straight up with you. I'm probably not the agent to work with you, because I don't want to set you up for failure, right? And even if that, I got a client I'm helping right now is in a very tough spot. He bought the property 3 years ago. However, he bought it at the height of during the COVID stuff, where people were offering 50, 60, 100K over asking. And he paid like 50K over asking back then. And now, like, we're at a point where he's just going to break even, if that. And I lowered my commission significantly to try to help this guy out. You have to be very careful. So we're starting to see a lot of that happening right now. We're seeing people that are leaving and they're trying to sell their place, and they're listing it higher than what it's worth because they overpaid.
Yeah.
You just got to pay attention to what's going on. So again, it depends on how long you're going to be able to stay in that property, right? You said 5 years, but again, Hawaii, it's at least 3 years. But even then, I'm seeing people that have been here for 3 years starting to have these problems because they overpaid. So if you're going to pay asking price and you're going to be here at least 3 years, you should be fine. But yeah, these are all things that people need to factor in, Tanya, because a lot of times they just see the numbers and say, okay, the numbers work. They're not thinking about 3 to 5 years from now, if they have to move or they get a job somewhere else or something in life changes. You have to factor in the unknown.
Yeah.
Always.
In today's world, so many people change careers multiple times. They move way more than we used to 20, even 10, 20, 30 years ago. So yeah, thinking about what makes sense for your lifestyle. And I know we see social media and people living in these houses that we think, oh my gosh, like, we have to have a house that looks like this or is like this. So we get this comparison in us. And a lot of people do buy those houses that they potentially can't afford because of wanting I have to have this certain place. But really, like, checking yourself and being like, okay, being more open to potentially moving somewhere different, a different area, or looking at the whole scenario for your long-term goals. Because like you said, with that guy, what made me think in that scenario, like he could have been paying rent and then investing some of that money. And now that money, he could have essentially probably made 50 or 100,000 if he hadn't have bought that house, potentially. Like everything's in hindsight. But yeah, you just really want to make sure for the long-term goals, you're setting yourself up for success and taking risk, but trying to minimize the risk when you can.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And one of the things that we talked about before too was like how things change, right? Looking at the taxes, property taxes, right? So Hawaii recently changed their laws, their property tax laws out here, where it used to be across the board, it was like 0.22 or 0.25%. Now I think it's 0.35% for property tax rate. So that's $3.50 per $1,000 that your home is worth. If your home is worth more than $1 million in Hawaii, which the median household price here is 1.15, then it goes up to 1.4%. So now you're up to 1440 per $1,000. So a lot of people were not ready for this. And this law went into effect this past year. I had a friend of mine who told me, he's like, man, last year I was paying about just under $4,000 a year in taxes. This year I'm paying 14,000. And I'm like, whoa. So
Exactly.
that happens, right? So you have to be ready for that. And I knew it was coming. And I told a bunch of people this too. I said, Hawaii lost so much money with their loss of income from tourism, right? Because during the pandemic, you had this entire period where flights were getting canceled coming in. It just was not there. The tourism industry got destroyed. That is where the state gets a lot of their revenue from, right? From the taxes that they charge on tourism. They didn't get that. So where are they going to get that money from? It took them 4 years to do it, but yeah, they raised property taxes here, which was something that people were not expecting to have happen. Again, you got to pay attention to your market. You got to pay attention to where you live and see the things that are going on so you can prepare yourself for it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many good things you said there. And I think talking to somebody who's still renting here, I was in contract to buy a house several years ago that fell through on the seller's end. I'm still able to keep my rent very low. And a lot of people, there's this stigma like, oh, your rent's always going to go up. Barriers around that, especially in certain states. So like in my case, my rents in almost 6 years now, my rents only went up not even 30% total. So I've kept my expenses, the same. I have a roommate living with me to supplement because it's like a bigger house too, which is great. Sure. And I know the landlord personally. So like there are situations like everybody's just like, rent just goes up, rent goes up. That's just like a blanket statement that people throw out there. And it's not necessarily. And if it does, sometimes it's not as much as that property. It's not $1,000 a month like that property tax.
Yeah.
No, I mean like
100%. Yeah. I interviewed a guy on the podcast a while back, but his big thing was he rents where he lives and he buys where he rents. So he will buy properties to rent out, but everywhere he lives himself, he'll rent the property instead of buying it. So I was like, I thought that was very interesting. And I've heard that before. I've heard other people doing that before. Me personally, that's not what I would do, but it works for him and it works for other people. You being a renter works for you with your situation. And you got to do what works for you. And the difference is between you and every other average Jane out there, right? That might want to rent a place and they don't have their finances in order. That's like the big difference right there. Like you understand where your money's going. You built a good spending plan, a good budget, right?
Yeah.
So you know how to leverage that and use it to be able to save and invest and not have to worry about that. Where a lot of people will find a place that, oh yeah, I can afford this place. For same thing as like I was talking about with buying a house. They're like, oh, I can afford this monthly payment, but they're not paying attention. That monthly payment is more than 30% of their income. Right.
Yep.
That same rule applies to renting, right? Because this is your living expenses, right? So these are the things that people need to pay attention to. 100%.
And the other thing is like not being ashamed to get a roommate. I don't need to have a roommate. I could make it work if I wanted to, which is a good situation to be in and something that I've set myself up with the last 5 years. But I don't mind having a roommate, because this house is bigger and we have our own setup, but like it's helping supplement now my being able to save and invest and travel and do other things I want to do. So like people just get so caught up in like, I have to have my own place. It has to look like this. Who is telling you that? Or why do you think? And then what do your finances look like? Like understanding where your money's going every month, understanding those percentages. Like it's not crazy to me because I see it every time because we're not taught this stuff, most of us, but the percentages that people don't know how much they're spending. Like I see people's food category at 25, 30% of their budget often.
Yeah.
And like, where's my money going? I'm like, you're eating it all. Like you're eating it.
You might as well put some cash on a plate and season it up and get out a fork and knife and just eat the paper.
Yeah, inflation, but there's still things you can do to be more mindful and intentional with your money. And it's a little bit more difficult. That's still my most challenging category, but I'm committed to only spending less than 15% of my income on food category a month.
Yeah. That's still my most challenging category too, but which is why like I have a fund. So I do sinking funds, right? So I have an account that is strictly for going out to eat, going to the movies, things like fun money. It's like for different things like that for me and the family, right? This is what we have. And if we go over, well, then that's it. Like we're done for the month, right? Until that pot gets filled again. But again, it goes back to a lot of this is just being mindful, right? Being mindful of your finances and what's going on in the world. You have to pay attention. Like you can't let a dip in the stock market dictate you selling all of your stocks, selling everything that you have, because
Please no.
you're going to wind up being in a place where it's like, wow, I really wish I didn't do that. I don't know how many people I've talked to that said in 2008, when the real estate market crashed, they decided to start selling all their stocks, right? Because they thought, oh, same thing's going to happen here. And it did. And what they didn't realize is when they were selling at a low already, because when it came back strong, and for those that kind of just hung out and stayed there, like I knew a guy personally, he was one of my neighbors who had a bunch of money in the stock market. He had a government thrift savings plan, so it's similar to a 401k plan. And 2008 happened and he didn't do nothing. And he had, I think at the time, $1 million in there, and it dropped down to like 700K, to where I think 12 years later, he got it up to 17 million just because he didn't touch his money and he kept investing in it. And when that happened, he said, okay, cool, everything's on sale. And he kept pushing pumping more money into it. So yeah, I think it was like 12 or 14 years later, it turned into 17 million. The thing is, the beauty about compound interest is you got to let it do its job. You can't sit there and say, oh, it works for me today, but it's not going to work tomorrow, so I'm going to go ahead and pull out. No, you got to let it do its thing. If it ever got to the point where the stock market went completely to zero for everything, well, that's just not a good place for the entire world or economy to be.
Yeah, we would all,
that
would be the least of our worries.
Yeah.
That would be the least of our worries if we went to zero in the stock market.
100%.
Which is never happened.
Some type of apocalyptic event is happening right now.
We would have bigger worries than that. Yeah. So I'm not worried. I think like what you said, that's why I still recommend working with an advisor, because some people like, oh, you can invest on your own, which I think you need to know as much as you can about it and learn the main terms and terminology. And you can have some investing that you're doing on your own just to learn and see what they're doing. But I think the thing that saves a lot of people is having that advisor, that person be like, no, like you're not going to do that. Because if we're left to our own will and our habits, our fear, and your family, friends going to be like, you're going to feed into that panic a lot of the times, and you're going to want to sell or take a loan out on your 401k or whatever people want to do now over and over again to pay off debt. I don't know. It's crazy. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why it's important. If you're not comfortable with that kind of thing, to go ahead and either get a coach or a financial advisor. Tanya and I are both financial coaches, and even me as a financial coach, I have a financial advisor that I work with as well when it comes to my own personal finances, because sometimes I need somebody to smack me in the back of the head and say, hey, dude, like, what are you doing? Why do you want to do that? Right. As a matter of fact, I was having a conversation with him yesterday about adding more money to an account that I opened up for my kids, that I want to start dumping more money into that, and gave him my reasons why. And that was that. It's good to have a sanity check, right? So whether or not you want to work with a coach, an advisor, or just have a mentor, whatever it is, it's good to have. Like I said, I have an advisor. I've paid coaches for all different aspects of things that I do. I'm in a mastermind for real estate that helps me with my real estate and my businesses. You got to invest in yourself, 100%.
Same. And you want to use that professional or person who's ahead of you to be like, okay, what did you do? How did you do it? And what can I learn from? Not trying to YouTube everything, taking months, years to figure it out on your own, and then making the wrong decision or being afraid to make a decision. So never starting to invest like a lot of people do. It is good. You don't have to meet. I always tell people to meet with several financial advisors. And are they explaining this to you like in a way that you can understand? Do you resonate with them? Can you have a good relationship? Like same for me. I can text my advisor. I text him like every couple, at least once a month about something. So it's good to have that type of relationship with somebody just to get their thoughts and perspective, and then start to track every year where you're at and where you're going to go and know that number that you're trying to reach.
100%. 100%. I think with that, we could kind of wrap this up, but this was just Tanya and I just having a conversation. We were just on, did another episode that we recorded and said, hey, let's record just us having a chat about what's going on. Again, completely unscripted, but it's great to have these conversations. Like even in this moment, like it gets me thinking, right? So as I'm sitting here talking to you, it gets me thinking about, okay, what's my next move? What are some things I need to be paying attention to? And I think these are conversations people need to be having.
Yeah.
Go have this conversation with your significant other or your partner or a friend of yours that you are talking to finances about, or your mentor, or whoever it is that might be in your life that you think you should have this conversation with, right?
Share
And
this episode with them.
Absolutely.
Just if you don't want to talk, actually, if you're scared to have the conversation, share this and be like, hey, I listened to this, and give us that 5-star review so that we can help
Yeah.
more people and word out there on financial freedom.
Or reach out to the Money Life Coach or reach out to me, and
Yes.
we'll be happy to have that conversation with you. But again, Tanya, always great to talk to you. I'm kind of glad to do this not in an interview. So it's kind of just us having a conversation, which was fun. So again, I appreciate your time. I really
Of
do.
course. Yeah, it's been awesome and excited to continue to do this in the future.
Awesome.
Thanks you guys for listening. And we'll
So,
talk
hey,
to you.
listeners, you guys know the deal. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Aloha from Hawaii,
And Lake Tahoe.
and have a great rest of your day. Thank you for making it to the end of this episode. Greatly appreciate you being here with me today on the Average Joe Finances podcast. If you haven't done so yet, make this the episode that you go leave us a 5-star rating or subscribe to our YouTube channel. The Average Joe Finances podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Have an outstanding day.